evening. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the St. Louis Zoo. I'm Louise Bradshaw. I'm the Director of Education here at the St. Louis Zoo, and it's really my pleasure to be able to host you here tonight and hear this absolutely fabulous lecture by Jeff Ettling, one of our favorite curators, right? And so let's have the Herp team give Jeff a round of applause and stand up and be all silly. Okay, great. Okay, you're done. You don't need to talk. It's all over. Just sort of in the way of a few formalities before we actually get going and hear Jeff's lecture, I want to make a special mention of thanks to the Academy of Science St. Louis. They really help us with all of these lectures, get the word out, promote them. And a couple of things I want you to make sure to notice. In addition to the upcoming talks, one of which on sustainability will be here at the St. Louis Zoo on April 16th by Gene Ponzi. We also have a variety of different activities. And then Carolyn in back, who's with the Academy, has some sign-up sheets, email sign-up sheets if you're not already on our mailing list and the Academy's mailing list about these lectures. Please sign up. And then we also have a little evaluation form going around, which will really help both of us. We work together on these lectures and be able to figure out how best to communicate to you, how best to get things out to you, what kinds of things you would like to hear about. So I think in the way of a very slight introduction for Dr. Ettling, which is really exciting to be able to say. So Jeff has been a colleague of mine here at the St. Louis Zoo for a number of years. He's worked at a variety of AZA institutions, always with this sort of unitary focus on herpetology, with a few aquatic things to the side, which is really great. And one of the really, I think, hallmarks of Jeff, and one of the things he really brings to everything that he does, is collaboration, the spirit of working together, building things in partnership, building things bigger than one person can or one organization can. And I know through his reflections on a decade of working in Armenia, you're going to see some really excellent case studies in that spirit of collaboration for conservation. Without further ado, Jeff Ettling.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us here tonight. And it's kind of really hard for me to believe that it's been a decade that has gone by that we've spent working in Armenia. And what started out as really kind of a simple project has blossomed into something that's kind of exceeds even my expectations. So what I'd like to start off with is a short video that we produced over the last couple of years that'll kind of give you an insight to what I'm going to talk about in the PowerPoint, but it'll also show you the country itself, and it'll give kind of a reference point for the slides that I'll show you in the PowerPoint.
Ecology can take place anywhere. Right now, we're not too far out of the town of Abuvian, the country of Armenia. And what we're doing is working with Armenian vipers. They live in concert with agriculturalists, horticulturalists, and pastoralists. How they live together is a fascinating ecological study, and that's what we're here looking at.
Animals are very tolerant to humans. And where humans do not disturb them, animals just come very close. And what I observed in protected areas, just the wildlife are roaming everywhere, just because humans don't disturb them. That's interesting to find the limits of tolerance, humans to wildlife and wildlife to humans.
But at the same time, we need to be very careful with snakes. Actually, the places where they are building the buildings, which is around where the living is venomous and dangerous snakes.
People here in Armenia don't like snakes in general, especially poisonous ones, because they considered some danger from them. But they don't realize and don't care that nature itself, it's like a chain, everything is linked to each other. If they destroy one chain, they will lose another part of the chain.
Be able to inform people, you know, not only just about the Armenian viper, but about snakes in general and the role that they play. The fact that, you know, just because you're afraid of it doesn't mean you have to kill it. Through WildCare Institute, one of our, you know, the goals of the Institute is not just to collect scientific, you know, information, but to impart technology like we've done with the radio telemetry to colleagues in foreign countries, and also to educate, you know, that it has to be this really overarching approach that has multi-facets that come into play, because you can collect all the scientific information you want and come up with a conservation strategy, but if you can't get buy-in from the people that live here, then it's never going to succeed.
When we go to the mountains, people always ask us, why don't we carry the firearms? Because it's dangerous. Because there are many bears there and wolves. I say they're just the only animal that I fear are people. And firearms will not help. I've seen many venomous vipers, so it's not a problem. Just people have the need to know how to behave with animals in the correct way. Because animals do not attack people just without reason. If not cornered, animal will never attack you. Just don't go to the cave if you know that the brown bear is inside. Just that's simple.
So, for example, in the places where the humans can go. So the reason of the state reserve is that no people come and disturb these places, so and disturb their natural habitats.
Even what we're finding out about the viper is going to have more far-reaching implications for a lot of other species, because if you're protecting habitat for one species, you're taking in everything else as well. Snakes are a vital part of the ecosystem. You know, I mean, they eat a lot of rodents, and they're also food for other animals. It's a long-term project, but I think you know, that at the same time we'll actually branch out and start studying some other species of reptiles here and other types of wildlife as well, and hopefully be able to bring that all together into a really good package of, you know, this is how we can manage the environment here in Armenia.
Learning by doing. We need to go away from theoretical education. We need to do something practical. Because recently, for example, I heard a very smart idea that if you hear, you forget. If you see, you remember. And if you do, you learn. That's true. Because, for example, I don't know about different countries, but in Armenia, education in biology and in environment, it's purely theoretical. So students don't have an opportunity to go to the mountains to learn and see what they hear about. So they finish their education, they get their degree, and they just stop because they don't understand what they do and for what. So we need to move children and students to nature.
There we go. So I think that video kind of encapsulates a lot of what we've been doing in Armenia for the past 10 years. But what I'd like to do now is kind of run through, what some of the factors are that have contributed to our work there, why the snake's in danger to begin with, and what the ramifications have been of the information that we've collected there over the last 10 years. And this is probably one of the first questions I get asked is, well, if the snake lives in such a remote area, why is it endangered anyway? And there are a number of reasons, but historically the species has had a very fragmented population. And if you look in the lower left-hand corner, it has a isolated population, or distribution I should say, in Armenia, adjacent eastern Turkey, and northwestern Iran. And on that image there, it shows two different subspecies, but based on recent genetic information, we know this is all just one species. And if you look at the map of Armenia, which is the larger one to the right, you see that they have a very fragmented distribution, and within each one of those little ballooned areas, you see locations where the snake has been found. So that probably a lot of this was shaped by past glacial events, but what we're seeing today is a lot of human encroachment on these already fragmented areas, which has had further consequences for the survival of the snake. And probably the two largest factors are kind of go hand in hand, are overgrazing and agriculture. And in this particular image, this is one of our two study sites. You see agricultural fields down in the valleys between the two mountains, and then all of these cattle and sheep and goats that are grazing on the actual foothills of where the snakes live. And so what we've been able to document over the past 40 years is about an 88% drop in population numbers. If you look at what Ilya Darevsky, one of Russia's most famous herpetologists, he was documenting upwards of 20 snakes per hectare in 1963, and now we're looking at about 4 to 10 snakes per hectare. So it's dropped pretty drastically. Another problem is overcollection for the exotic snake or pet trade, and it's not that they're popular here in the U.S., but they are in Europe. And this is the only place in the world that I've ever ran into a professional snake collector, this gentleman down here in the bottom, and he's probably been single-handedly responsible, at least for the demise of this particular population, or at least its reduction in numbers. But the problem with a communal hibernator like Armenian vipers is if you know where to go find them and you get there at the right time in the spring, you can collect mass numbers that are coming out of hibernation. And what you're seeing in these two upper photos is one of the den sites. The snakes are coming out there and basking in the early spring. And then, like snake populations all over the world, persecution is a major problem. And pastoral shepherds and farmers consider this particular species to be a threat to their livestock, so they kill just about everyone they see. So we've had to do a lot of grassroots education with the individuals we run into to try to change their attitudes. And since this is a species that's endemic to their region, it seems to work when we have these one-on-one discussions with them, particularly when they see us tracking a snake and come over to see what we're doing with this antenna and see the viper, and we talk to them. We think, well, we'll find out if this little talk worked or not, because when we come back in 3 days, if we find the snake dead, we know that as soon as we left, they turned the rock over and smashed it. But we've never ever had that happen. So we feel really good about the fact that the kind of the grassroots approach we're taking so far is having an impact. The second question that I get asked is, where on earth is Armenia? I mean, sometimes that's the first question, because most people, from a geographic standpoint, at least here in the U.S., have no reference for where Armenia is located. It's a former Soviet Union country. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Armenia seceded as an independent country. It's small. It's only about the size of the state of Maryland, but it's very diverse, and it's a mountain country. It's part of the Lesser Caucasus mountain chain, and is considered one of the 34 biodiversity hotspots identified by Conservation International. And you can see its nearest neighbors. So to the west you have Turkey, to the east you have Azerbaijan, and they don't get along with either one of those countries for a couple different reasons. But you also notice that Azerbaijan has this little bitty sliver down on between Iran and Armenia, and I asked how that happened, but somehow during Soviet time there was some dispute, and the president at the time just decided to give Azerbaijan this sliver of land. So it makes, politics in that area a little interesting. They do get along. They have good relationship with the Republic of Georgia to the north and with Iran to the south. They have open border. There's lots of Iranian students that attend Yerevan State University. I've had several Iranian students work with me, and so they're always asking me to come to Iran, and I said, well, do you understand what the politics are like? And they say, that's just the old guys, don't worry about it. What we wanted to do was actually select 2 different sites that were very different. We wanted to look at one site where there was a lot of human impact, and we wanted to look at another one that was natural. But part of the problem is there's really, at least here and probably in most places in the world, there's not a lot of truly natural areas left that where people haven't had some kind of footprint on the landscape. And so we opted to call it recovered natural landscape because the area we're working in is protected, but for a number of years they allowed grazing there, and it's only been since probably about 2006 that they've banned grazing there. So it's been a short period of time that it's been allowed to go feral. So these 2 sites, the one to the north, which is about 23 kilometers from the capital city of Yerevan, it's in Koytak province in an area we call Abuvian, and then about 397 kilometers south, right on the Iranian border, is Shikoho State Reserve, which was established in 1958, and so that was our recovered natural landscape. And so just a few more details about both of these particular sites. All of the actual total area was calculated after the fact. We had like 14 vipers that we radio tracked at Abuvian, and we took all of their data points and put them into one program and calculated out the minimum convex polygon, or what the actual area was that all those snakes used. And basically what it does is just takes the outer points and connects them. So it's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but encompasses the entire area the snakes used. Doesn't mean they used every bit of the area within there, but at least you're encompassing the area that those 14 snakes were using. And then we also did some looking at some areas of trying to delineate between agriculture and remaining steppe habitat. So everything you see in yellow is areas of agriculture, and everything that's remaining that's in green is steppe. And then the lines you see are some ephemeral streams that run through the site, and one's an irrigation canal from Soviet times that has since been abandoned. But it kind of gives you a good overview, and so you have to go in and draw all this using ArcMap and be able to calculate out what the area is. And we were able to do some spatial ecology work using that. And I'm not going to go into a lot of the detail about that, but I just wanted to kind of show you an overview of what the site looked like. But we were able to calculate out that about 310 hectares, or roughly 65% of the area, is still steppe, and about 35% is cropland. And the elevation right there runs between about 1,200 and 2,200 meters. When you look at the recovered natural landscape in Shikoho Reserve, I'm kind of giving away some of what the end results are going to be when you look at what the overall size of the study area is. It's only 41.2 hectares for 11 snakes use that site. It's at a little higher elevation. It's 2,200 meters plus. It's basically alpine meadow, and as I mentioned earlier, the area that we're working in was actually annexed as part of Shikoho State Reserve in 2006. So up until that point, a lot of farmers would run their cattle up into these really lush green pastures in the summertime, and then back down into the valleys during the winter, because the snow up here is 3 or 4 foot, in depth. So you wouldn't be able to survive up there in the wintertime. So just a little bit about the tools that we used in our research. Spatial ecology was a big part of it. We used radio telemetry and GIS to answer a lot of our questions concerning home range size and how the snakes were moving through the landscape. This was kind of tricky. I mean, when my first trip there in 2004, we weren't really sure that radio telemetry would work, because there's a lot of problems with signal bounce in these rocky areas, and being that this is extremely rocky, we thought, well, there's no sense in initiating a big study if the technology won't even work here. So we wanted to basically implant about 4 snakes, and it really wasn't feasible from a financial point of view to take a veterinarian with me. So they taught me how to put these in. I was a little nervous about that, but it worked out all right. But once we figured out that radiotelemetry did work there, and we were going to use large numbers of snakes in our sample size, I budgeted and I've taken veterinarians with me ever since. And that's been, it was a big load off my mind, just to say the least. We also wanted to look at the genetic diversity and population structure within both of these sites. And so we wanted to be able to quantify the genetic diversity of the vipers in both of these landscapes. And then we really wanted to look at the extent of the structure within the populations as well. And the main emphasis was to really try to delineate specific sites that were in need of conservation efforts. And I should say that this was interesting in its own right because I discovered that I was the first person, at least in modern times, that's ever had a permit to legally take biological samples out of the country. So that pretty much tells you that everything else that shows up in the literature has been taken out illegally, because and it was quite a task to get the first permit, and then we've since done that twice following that. And since then, we've seen a lot of data appear from other species, and my colleague who works in the Ministry of Nature Protection said, I don't know how they got that out of there because I didn't give them a permit. So it's nice to know that, you know, going through the proper channels. I mean, and literally to publish in the peer-reviewed literature, you have to state that you collected these with permits to do so and permission through like an IACUC through the institution you're working with. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we found out about the spatial ecology, and I'm not going to give you my dissertation defense. I've really just taken out key elements of this just to illustrate some of the really high points of what we've discovered and some of the things that were actually quite amazing that I never expected to see happen. So we had a few objectives and predictions that we made up front. We really wanted to be able to describe and compare home range size and movements between snakes that were inhabiting these two different landscapes. And we really expected that prey abundance would be higher in the recovered natural area versus the human disturbed area, mainly due to the overgrazing pressures. And you would really think that it might be the opposite, that where you have agriculture, that there would be a higher abundance of rodents just because of the seed base. But based on the overgrazing that we observed, we thought, well, the natural habitat has been degraded quite a bit, so it's probably likely that the rodents and other small mammals aren't really all that abundant there anymore. We also expected that snakes with smaller home range sizes would have better body condition, and that's kind of contrary to what a lot of researchers predict. They often say, well, a larger snake needs more resources, so it needs to move further. My stance on that is, well, if food's abundant, why do you want to move? I mean, if you're bringing me my dinner, I'm not going to move very far. So that's kind of the hypothesis that we made. So we followed snakes in these two different sites for 2 years in both sites. We had 14 snakes that we followed in the human disturbed landscape and 11 in the recovered natural landscape. And what you see here is a compilation of the home ranges of all those snakes. And the thing that's amazing is if you look down at the bottom is the home range size of the snakes in that human modified landscape is about 5 times larger than it is in the recovered natural landscape. We're looking at about 25 hectares per snake in the human modified landscape, and it's only about 5 hectares in the recovered natural landscape. We also found that the movements of the snakes, the daily movements of the snakes, were considerably different between the two sites as well. In the human modified landscape, they're moving about 18 meters per day, and in the recovered natural landscape, only about 10. And this is kind of a misnomer because you have 2 dots, and we know good and well that a snake didn't crawl in a straight line, but it's the best estimate we have. But with some recent technology, I think we're finally going to be able to look at how snakes actually crawl through the landscape. There's a company in California that's actually making a GPS data logger that you can actually remotely download the information from, and you put the points in it, you know, the intervals that you want, and then you go out and get within about 30 foot of the snake with a laptop, and you can download all of the data points. So I think for the first time, we're going to be able to figure out how they actually use the landscape, and it'll be interesting to overlay that over the data that we have on these home range sizes to see really what areas are they really using. We have a good idea, but there's probably big areas that they're just completely avoiding. The only downside to this new technology is it's about $1,400 a transmitter. So the ones that we use now are about $300. So it's a bit of a difference in price. But the day's going to come also where we'll be able to just turn on the computer here and see what's going on. That hasn't happened yet for snakes. We're doing it with elephants, but not with snakes. And the one thing that I tried to stay away from for the longest period of time, because I knew it would turn into a project in its own right, was sampling prey. But it became apparent when we looked at the difference in home range sizes that there was something that was driving that. And so we ultimately bit the bullet and started sampling rodents. We did it in 3 different time periods. We did it in June and September of 2011 and in July of 2012. And we did 3 nights in all 3 of these time periods, and we did it at both study sites. So we basically set up a grid in these areas. We kind of randomly picked areas where snakes had occurred, and then we set up a grid that was 40 meters by 100 and put a trap every 10-meter interval. And kind of as we predicted, and it was actually skewed a lot more than I expected it would be, but over all of those trapping periods in the Bouvian site, we only caught a total of 5 small mammals, versus in Chickahoe, we caught a total of 43. So there's quite a bit of a difference in the availability there. And kind of as a side note, when we started looking back at all the snakes we had captured over the past 10 years, at the Bouvian site, we never had a viper regurgitate a rodent or rodents in the bag while we were holding them overnight. And at Chickahoe, we had about 15% of the snakes that would regurgitate a rodent or multiple rodents. So that kind of was also an indication of what we were seeing in terms of availability of rodents, that we just weren't seeing those in the stomachs of snakes at a Bouvian. Also, you'll also notice that there's a difference in the species composition between the 2 sites too, which was kind of interesting. Just a little bit lower elevation. In a Bouvian, the Maronis persicus, that's a jerd, which is a close relative of the gerbil. And I'm not even sure how that animal got in the trap because it filled the entire thing up. And I thought I had a rat in there at first. It was so big. Until I saw it had a hairy tail and realized it wasn't a rat. But also the 2 mice that occur there, there's a pygmy forest mouse and a wood mouse. And you notice at the Chickahoe site, we've got the common vole and shrew. There's a shrew there that actually the snakes feed upon as well. The most interesting thing about the traps that I learned that you have to be very careful is at the Bouvian site, when I would find the trap was closed, and it had holes in the side, I could shake the rodent down to one end and kind of peek in to see what was in there before I dumped it in a bag. And probably one of our last sampling efforts, I shook the trap, opened the end of the door, and a viper's head came out. So vipers get in the traps too. Wasn't quite expecting that. So combined, we had 680 total trap nights, and we ran all these data through this, what's called the Schnabel index, and just based on our data, it's predicting that a Bouvian only had 10 small mammals, whereas Chickahoe had 129. Now you have to realize that's based strictly on what we captured. So the rodent populations and other small mammals are probably higher than that, but this is just an index based off of our captures. So with that in mind, we calculated out this body condition index and tried to get a handle on correlation between body condition and home range size. And this was the biggest surprise of the entire study to me, because I really expected that the snakes at a Bouvian were going to have a much poorer body condition, and that wasn't the case at all. If you look on the left, you can see we were able to include all the snakes we'd ever captured, even if they weren't included in the radiotelemetry, because some of these were smaller juvenile snakes. We had 73 total from a Bouvian, 56 from Chickahoe, and you can see that they're very similar in length and weight. And when we calculated out body condition, we found no difference in body condition between these 2 different populations, and no relationship between body condition and home range size. So that led us to conclude that really the small mammal abundance, as you noted in those previous slides, differed significantly between these 2 landscapes. And we really think the lack of complexity in the landscape surrounding the croplands is what's really having an impact on the small mammal populations. I mean, with all of the grass being grazed down very short and all of the hoof action on the soil, it's very trampled, so it's very hard for rodents or other small mammals to burrow into this to take shelter. And it also makes them very vulnerable to a lot of other predators, foxes. There's a lot of aerial predators there in terms of hawks and owls. We also noted that the viper home ranges differed quite significantly between these two sites, and what we basically came up with this with high quality habitat equals smaller home range, and low quality habitat equates to a larger home range. And so what we think we're really seeing in terms of the fact that they had equivalent body condition at both of these sites is that the snakes at Abuvian just have to move further to find food, which is why their home range size is 5 times larger than the ones at the Chickahoe site. And it may be that they're compensating for this lack of small mammals by eating other types of food. We know that they eat orthopteran insects because we've had snakes at the Chickahoe site regurgitate katydids, and there's probably 5 or 6 species of orthopterans that occur at the Abuvian site, and it may be higher than that. But they also feed on nestling birds. And when I first read that in the literature prior to making my first trip there in 2004, I'm like, where are they catching birds at? Until I got there and saw that the trees are quite dwarfed in these areas, and a lot of these passerines actually nest on rock ledges, so it makes it quite easy for a snake to get up and feed on them, even if they're not an arboreal species by most of their lifestyle. In fact, one of my colleagues there filmed a viper in a nest eating all the nestling birds, so we know they do that there. So they may be compensating for this lack of small mammals by eating other types of animals, and they're obviously maintaining an equivalent body condition, which I think is pretty cool. So with that in mind, we kind of shifted gears a little bit and wanted to look at what the genetic diversity was like in both of these populations and to see whether the human disturbance really had an impact on gene flow. So based on the results of the radiotelemetry data that I've just talked about, we predicted that we would find no structure. And I should back up and say that what we had within both study sites is we had 2 sampling sites. And initially my committee said, well, you need to make sure that those 2 sites are equidistant at both areas. And I said, well, snakes don't hibernate that way. They don't say, well, I'm going to hibernate 3.2 kilometers from this one. So we tried to get as close as we could. So in the Abuvian site, the 2 den sites were 3.2 kilometers apart. At the Chickahoe site, they were about 1.5 kilometers apart. So what we were looking at was to see whether there was still movement between these 2 subpopulations, if you'll have it, and whether there was an impact from the human disturbance. We also predicted that there would be strong genetic differentiation between the 2 sites, which are separated by 397 kilometers. And so this is what we found out, is that our predictions were correct, is that at both sites there was no structure, which means you still have gene flow occurring between the sites. At the Abuvian site, we did have some indications of inbreeding, which will be interesting to follow long term. It was at that South Den site. So long term, it'll be, I'll be curious to see whether the increased human activity there, whether it eventually shuts that population completely off from the North Den. There's some indication that that may happen. Obviously down here at the Chickahoe site, where there's total protection, we don't see anything happening. And between the 2 sites, they're quite significantly different. And so what we're hypothesizing now is that all these other fragmented populations throughout the country are all probably very different from one another, which raises a whole nother question of going back in and evaluating them, because they probably all need to be managed differently from a conservation perspective. You're not going to capture everything by just protecting one population. So that's part of our goal for the future, is to go in there and actually get genetic samples from these other sites. In 2006, I attempted to do that, and it was a big failure, because originally what I was planning to do was kind of look at the phylogeography of the species and reconstruct how it remigrated after the last glacial event. But it became apparent we were never going to be able to collect enough samples to make that happen, because we had 6 or 10 of us working in a site and we'd catch 1 or 2 snakes. So some of the populations are very, very small. And the biggest problem is that when they're coming out of hibernation at one site, they're doing that at another, and unless you have multiple teams that are out and can capture snakes on those days where they're emerging or be there on the right day, you're never going to get all of that. But we're hoping over the next 5 years or so that we can actually get back in there and get enough samples that we can actually look at that. And just kind of to reconfirm what we're seeing there, we actually ran the data through a program called Structure. And for any of you that have seen any of these graphs, like the one on the bottom, usually they have all these multiple colors that show the differences between the population. And here, there's not much of that, of anything going on here. You see that the 2 The green blocks on the left are the abuvion, the two sites in the abuvion study site, and the two red blobs on the right are the Shikaho site. And they have a little bit of, you see a little bit of red and a little bit of green infiltrating into those. It may indicate that there's some long-term connection between these populations, but for the most part, they're identical within both of these sites. So to kind of conclude from the genetic portion of the study, that despite the human disturbance and modifications of the landscape, all of the over-collection pressures, and the signs of inbreeding that we saw, and what we're seeing with the movements by our radiotelemetry data, is that there's still a good exchange of genetic material between these two den sites. Also, we saw that at both sites that there really is no structure going on, that there is still plenty of movement going on, and ultimately what we really think needs to happen is that both of these sites be managed independently of one another and set up as separate conservation units. And so for some kind of overall conclusions or considerations from what I've just shown you is that really there needs to be habitat corridors. We hear about that for all species of wildlife, and this is kind of a simplistic drawing on the left of how that might look, but that there needs to be these corridors enable for there to be seasonal migrations from the den sites out to the foraging sites and back to the dens in the fall, and also to allow for gene flow between all of these adjacent hibernacula. And we know that probably within these areas, if we search hard enough, we would find other den sites. So there's a lot of mixing going on. And I think one of the things that I failed to mention earlier is that we typically think of males as being the big movers in most of these snake populations, but we had two females in the abuvion site. One moved 3.2 kilometers, and the other went the opposite direction, and they had the biggest home ranges. One of them had a home range that was like 85 hectares. So talking to some of my European colleagues, they said, well, we've based everything off of a few species, and I think as we start studying some of these other species, we're going to find out that they're doing different things. And it's not surprising that females may have a bigger home range or that they're doing a lot of moving themselves. Overgrazing, the snakes overall don't seem to be impeded, at least their movements don't seem to be impeded by the livestock and their grazing. Unfortunately, it appears that it has had an impact on small mammal abundance, and as a result, the snakes have an increased home range size. And so kind of based off of all that, we've made a couple recommendations to the government, and one of those is that the highest priority should obviously be for intact parcels of land that are remaining. But with that said, there's a lot of agricultural development too. So not only do we need to maintain adequate corridors, but the big take-home message for me has been that you need to maintain the quality of the habitat within those corridors, because just because you have habitat remaining, if it isn't of quality for the prey items that are living there, then it's probably not going to be all that good for the predators that are living there as well, because there's going to be a reduction at some point in the prey availability. As I mentioned earlier, it was one of those situations where when I went to Armenia for the first time in 2004, we had a good idea of what we really wanted to try to accomplish. No one had really looked at spatial ecology of this species there before. We knew it was going to be challenging just because of the remote sites and getting people in there on a regular basis. But I think the end results have been more rewarding and more amazing than I could have ever imagined. Based off of our initial studies in between 2004 and 2005, my colleague Aram Agassian, he took that data and expanded the size, boundaries of both Khosrov State Reserve, where we did some of our initial work, and Shikaho State Reserve, which I thought was quite amazing. And then secondly, on October 15th of 2009, I was in Armenia at that time. They had a big celebration, the fact that Zangezur Sanctuary and Arabic National Park had been declared that day by the government. And one of the things we're trying to do is make all of these new national parks and sanctuaries that will kind of fit together and make corridors between all of the existing parks that are there. And at this celebratory dinner, Karin Manvelin, who you saw in that video, who's the director of World Wildlife Fund, got up and said a toast, and Armenians like to make a lot of toasts. It's kind of maybe a carryover from their days as part of the Soviet Union, but there's a lot of toasts. I can guarantee you that. But one of those was the fact that the work that we had been doing there over the last decade had been a part of the government's decision to declare these 2 new protected areas. And it was at that point that I realized it really doesn't matter how small the project you're working on. It's when you take all the little pieces and put them together. So the folks that have been doing work there with the Caucasian leopard and the black grouse, when all those things were put together and the government looked at this and said, you know, if all these people are coming here to work on these species, these areas must really be truly valuable and we need to protect them. And that's what happened. So that was really a take-home message to me, that you should really never worry about how small the project is, but what the ultimate impact when it's added up with all the other pieces might be. And in this case, it was quite dramatic. And one of the things that's kind of happened as an offshoot, I mean, we started in 2004 looking at conservation of Near East mountain vipers, which includes the Armenian viper and 7 other species. But last year we expanded the scope of what we're doing, and we're now calling it the Center for Conservation in Western Asia. And so our focus will still be in Armenia, but we'll now be able to look at the surrounding countries in the Caucasus and part of that Irano-Anatolian area as well. And what we're hoping to do is be able to do some more holistic planning and looking at conservation for some of these species that are here on the screen, like Bezoar goat, which are endangered there, Syrian brown bear, and some of the other species of vipers, like this small meadow viper. And I think that we've laid the groundwork there, and we're quite trusted there now, and so it makes sense for us to do this, is that even if we're going to continue doing the reptile work as part of our primary focus, we can help garner support from other institutions here in the U.S. to help them get some of these other projects done. And what I hope to do this summer is be able to sit down with them and look at what are the needs and how can I help them address some of those, either financially or through other types of resources. And with that, I'd like to end by acknowledging a lot of different people that have helped, folks in my dissertation committee, folks in the lab group that I spent the last 7.5 years as part of, here at the zoo, Dr. Bonner and Dr. Miller for allowing me the opportunity to pursue the degree, my staff for putting up with me being gone for extended periods of time, and a lot of other people, including my Armenian and Russian colleagues. In fact, I now have a second family, because whenever I'm in Armenia by myself, I stay with Aram and Levon and their family. And I think the human dimension of it turned into something that I never anticipated. You know, I knew I was going there with tunnel vision to do one thing, and it turned into something completely different. And I think that's probably the biggest surprise. And then I've had a lot of field assistants. I've had 2 veterinarians. Dr. Tara Brooks, who's a private vet here in St. Louis, has been to Armenia with me 3 times. And then Erica Travis, who you saw in the video, she was one of our resident vets years ago and is now at the Hogel Zoo. She's been there a couple times as well. Several of my staff members have ventured along. Andy Snyder, good friend of mine, has been there quite a few times too. And my family for thinking I was going to disappear forever when I went to the other side of the globe, but that didn't happen. So, and particularly my parents for putting up with a basement full of snakes during my youth. It did pay off. So with that, I'd like to end by thanking the financial supporters, which the zoo's been a part of. The Association of Zoos and Aquariums, the Conservation Endowment Fund, funded a big chunk of the work, as well as the Cleveland Metro Park Zoo. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Well, when I said they have no structure, it means that there's free movement between the populations. When I had those 2 that were 397 kilometers apart, and you saw that higher number, means that these 2 are very distinct from each other. And that's just kind of the simplistic look at that. Anything else? Well, I didn't tell them anything. They did in Armenian. It's kind of sad that having been there as long as I have, I only know a few words. It's a tough language. But one of the things we did early on, probably about 2007, is we made, and I should have brought one here tonight, but we made a poster and a pamphlet, and it's in 3 different languages. We have it in English, Russian, and Armenian. And they carry those with them all the time. And so if we run into someone like that, we just kind of take it as an opportunity to have this kind of impromptu education session, and they pull it out, and both the pamphlet and the poster kind of highlight the fact that this is an Armenian endemic found in the Armenian highlands, that what to do if you encounter a viper, that they really are more scared of you than you are of them, and the role they play in the ecosystem. And so usually one of my Armenian colleagues will have this dialogue back and forth with them and give them a poster and a brochure to take, and we end up seeing these taped up in little huts and things like that along the way. So, like I mentioned, these guys come over and they see what we're doing, and they see the snake there, and I was like, well, we're going to come back and find this dead in a couple days, but we've never had that happen. So that seems to be working. And the one thing that we really want to do now is that now that the research is done and I can take the blinders off, is we really want to go into like some of these villages where the snakes occur. It's really not the population in Yerevan, which is about the size of the city of St. Louis and metro area, that are having the impact. Is people that live out in these rural areas, which probably haven't changed in 100 years. They're very primitive, and poverty levels is very high. And so one of the things that we're hoping to do now is go in there and look at how can we help with their livelihoods in a way that they will also be able to practice sustainability with the environment, because right now they're just looking at ways to feed themselves and their families. So there are some organizations like Heifer International that's based out of Arkansas that's doing work there where they'll get starter pigs or sheep or whatever. So we're hoping maybe we can work with them, but also go in and do education in these villages, kind of like the town meeting. And the one beauty there is you can actually take a live venomous snake to a program and people can see it. It's a little harder to do that here in the States nowadays, but my colleagues do take them, and it has a bigger impact when they can see the real deal, and you have a real snake there that they can look at. And so we're going to actually do some of that, go in and have these planned meetings like in Chickahoe Village, and talk about the fact that they have species living right in their backyard that are not found anywhere else, and they have a lot of pride in not only their cultural heritage, but also their natural heritage as well. So I think if we can get that message out there and what they can do, that we can drive that home a little better. Yeah, well, unfortunately, most of them are coming off the Turkish side. They've been able to get a handle on it on the Armenian side. The airport that's there now is as modern as the one here in St. Louis, and they have all the scanners and everything else, so they pick up on anything that's going through. And there's been several times in recent years where our Rama's got a call that there were snakes in somebody's bag, and it was one of the guys that I showed on the slide earlier who was trying to ship some out to Europe. So they've been able to curtail that from that end. The problem is on the Turkish side, people will come in across the border and collect what they want and go back across without any ramifications. But the other sad thing is this species breeds real easily in captivity. These are mainly European snake collectors that have them. So there's really not a need to keep collecting mass numbers of these animals, is that once you get them established, they breed quite easily in that kind of situation. But I think that's going to have to be some of the target on that side, is increased enforcement. There's just not enough conservation agents, or whatever you want to call them, there to monitor that kind of activity. Well, that's interesting that you mentioned that. My 2 Armenian colleagues that were here twice in 2011, and one thing when they saw the numbers that we've produced here, they said, well, maybe we can send stock over and you guys can breed them here and then ship the babies back. And I said, well, what I'd rather do is set up a facility there, breed them in Armenia. We don't have to deal with all of the transportation logistics. We don't have to deal with disease surveillance, all those things. So that's really what we're getting ready to do right now, is we want to repurpose a house on the outskirts of Yerevan as a breeding facility, not only for Armenian vipers, but it'd be for about 10 other species of red list amphibians and reptiles, and then they would head start those animals there and then augment the remaining populations. So what we're hoping is going to happen is that Lavone is hopefully going to get a Fulbright scholarship this year, and he'll come and stay here in St. Louis for about 8 months or so and work with the staff in the herpetarium and learn all the husbandry techniques, the things you need to do to get these species to reproduce. And then he'll probably be directing this center on the ground there. And so we're trying to get all the logistics in place to get this, buy a house, which isn't all that expensive. It's about $20,000 US to buy a used house on the outskirts. So it's nothing fancy, but we're going to retrofit it anyway. But that's part of our goal, because based on the fact that we find low numbers in some of these populations, we think that it's time to bring some of those in, breed them, and then get babies back out into the wild. What's that? That's hard to say without looking at the numbers in these specific areas. And it may be that some of the populations that are in close proximity, maybe some of their genetic material would be integrated into that population, depending on what the size of what's left there. No, well, I've never been bitten, but my Armenian colleague has, and it's not a good bite. I mean, I don't think a bite by any venomous snake is one you want to do. But he's been bitten 14 times in his life, and this was probably the worst one, and only the second time that he's ever gone to the hospital. So, which was an interesting experience in its own right. Having doctors smoking in the hospital, and it was like 1950 in the U.S., so it was very different. But and they didn't have any antivenom there at the time. So he pretty much rode the thing out, and it had never been written up in the medical literature either. So we documented everything that happened and wrote up a small case study on what happened. But the kind of the ramifications of all that, being that I'm an optimistic, positive thinker, I realized that there was potential that somebody could possibly get bitten, but I put that in the back of my mind, so I had never taken antivenom there with me. But after that happened to Aram, the next year we actually were able to have products shipped from Croatia there. It's what we have here at the zoo. And so we now have antivenom available that we can take with us into the field. And there's a hospital in Kapan, which is about an hour from where we're at if someone was to have an accident. But the other thing that's really cool that came out of this is that since Aram is head of protected areas for the Ministry of Nature Protection, he's pretty high in the government. And he was able to get all the hospitals in Yerevan through the Ministry of Health. They actually are now importing this Croatian antivenom and have it in all the hospitals in Yerevan now too. So we're not going to have to rely on just having our own stock there anymore, but they actually have stuff there. There's 4 species of vipers, and this antivenom will cover all 4 that occur there. So that's the first time in Armenian history that they've actually had that. So there was something good that came out of Aram's last bite. Hopefully it's his last one, period. But well, I can't give you an exact number, but I can tell you from a synopsis of a recent study of all the Eurasian vipers, drop for drop, Armenian vipers are the most toxic, which was kind of a surprise to me as well. But they've been known to kill cattle. There's a documented death of a cow, so, I mean, you figure if you can drop a cow, you can probably do the same to a human. The thing about it is that probably the reason that that snake bites have never been documented in the literature is that until recent times, these snakes lived in remote areas where there were no people, and the only people that have been bitten are herpetologists. So, and that's the case in most areas of the world where you have snakes where there's no antivenom produced, is that there's not an economic incentive to produce an antivenom because it's an expensive proposition if people don't get bitten, but and it's typically herpetologists that get bitten by these species. Yeah. Well, I think the one that was documented, that was in the 60s, and I don't know if there's been one in recent times, but it's also interesting if you read some of Ilya Derevsky's field notes. He said that the farmers realized when the snakes finally would move off the mountain to go out to their foraging areas, so they would stay out of those low areas until the snakes had moved through. Then they'd go out and initiate their farming activities, which I think is pretty insightful that they were in tune and still seem to be in that fashion, that they they know when the snakes move, and so they just don't spend time out there in the fields. They wait till they've moved out to their foraging grounds. But they'll come out of hibernation and they'll stay on those slopes for about 3 to 4 weeks in the spring, and once they breed, then they disperse. And what you have is snakes coming from all these different areas and breeding at these sites, and then they finally move out to these foraging areas that are down in these lower areas, and then the farmers come in and do their thing. So I think that's kind of cool, and that's probably part of the reason that snake bite's been low as well, is they've just been in tune with the movements. Well, the new one that we've just started is we're doing a complete, hope to do a complete herp census of both Arabic National Park and Chickahoe, because they have an idea what's there, but it's never been cataloged in a systematic way. And so we just started that this past year. We actually have a trailer that sits right on Megri Ridge, which is the mountain that separates Chickahoe Reserve from Arabic National Park. And one of the things that I kind of take for granted until I always hear Aram say it in the video is that national parks and state reserves are off limits to people. It's a completely different philosophy than we have here in the U.S., where we open up national parks and make all these paved roads and stuff. I can tell you there that the roads are so rough you could lose a car in some of the potholes. That's how big they are. So they don't modify these areas at all, and they're off limits. So where we have our trailer, nobody else has access there. And it's on a ridge that makes it really good for patrolling for poachers and that. So when we're not there, we open it up to other people to use. So all of Reuben's rangers use it as a site they can stay, and they can see into both areas there to look for poachers. And the other thing that's interesting is that site is one of the last strongholds for leopard as well. We see scat, we see tracks. Never seen a leopard in the flesh, probably never will, but they're there in that particular area. Every snake that we've ever captured that was large enough to put a pit tag in, we've done so. The interesting thing is, at the two sites, we've only had a few recaptures. We're still catching lots of new individuals, but I think the two sites we're working in are probably two of the larger remaining populations. But the ones that we have recaptured, it's really interesting to see what their growth has been over 2 years. Some of it's quite phenomenal. I mean, they've almost doubled in size. But when you look at these Chickahoe snakes, I mean, and the amount of food they eat. And the other thing that's interesting is they have a very short window of time that they're actually out. So the ones at Abuvion that are a little bit lower elevation, they come out in May and they're back in hibernation in October. So they're out for quite an extended period, to be equivalent to snakes here in Missouri. At Chickahoe, they come out in mid-June and they're back in before the end of September. So that's a pretty tight window, not only to come out and eat, but they breed and give birth during that small window of time. So it's a pretty tight thing, and so they eat as much as they can. And I think that the fact that food's so abundant there, they've been able to thrive quite well. The other thing that's interesting about Chickahoe is there are a number of other reptile species that occur at that high elevation that are typically semi-desert species, live down low. The blunt-nosed viper, the Montpelier snake, a couple others occur at that high elevation. No one's sure why they're even there. And the only thing we can figure out is that the food is abundant enough that they're able to survive at that elevation. So that's something we're interested in looking at too. And the thing I didn't mention was we've been putting transmitters in blunt-nosed vipers, because we'll find one under a piece of tin right next to an Armenian viper. So we're real curious how they're segregating themselves in the landscape, or is there just enough food that they're both able to survive there in that particular area without any real competition. Well, I wasn't saying they were spread out. I was just saying they were moving as far, if not further, than the male snakes were moving, and that they had larger home range, which was interesting. I'm not sure how to explain that. In fact, most of my colleagues don't. We're kind of amazed that a female would have a home range that size. It's kind of highly unusual. But they're doing it. At least that particular population is. Now the ones in Chickahoe, males and females had pretty equivalent home range size. There wasn't much difference at all. Well, we really don't have any data to demonstrate that yet, but I'm sure there is. I mean, I think what we're going to have to look is whether there's change in elevation use by these snakes. We know they'll curve from about 1,200 meters all the way up to about 24. So it'll be interesting to see over time if that has an impact at all. I can tell you that, you know, the temperature shift is very different there. At least I haven't looked at it myself, but my colleagues say that in Yerevan, when I was there for 2 months in 2010, it was like 100 degrees, which is unusual for that area. And whether that trend's going to continue there and what impact it will have on the snakes and other wildlife, I really can't say right now. Well, in captivity, it's about 16 years. I doubt it's that long in the wild, but it's, you know, they have the potential to live that long. Well, I think when you tell them about the fact that they eat rodents and other things that impact their crop, they're all for that. You know, I mean, anything that can help them eliminate having loss, because a lot of what they put out is not only like corn and that, but they put out most of it's grain that they make it. Let me back up. A lot of it is for hay production, because with all the snow on the ground, they have to have some way to feed all their livestock all winter. So. They're all for anything that can help them with a sustained yield. I think that's probably one of the biggest ones. And I think when you tell them that they're really not a threat to their livestock at all, that kind of, you know, changes it. And I think the other thing that we've tried to do is, you know, you can't tell somebody just not to do something, because then they're going to do it anyway. But I think if you tell them a reason why and what an alternative might be, is so like say, well, between May and the first part of June, it's probably best if you avoided this particular zone, because that's where the concentration of snakes are. And there's still plenty of grass in the lower areas that they can take advantage of. So every little bit seems to help. So is that it? Okay. Well, thank you.